Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Seek for Truth. Tonight I've got Michael Bugg on with us. We're going to talk tonight about the end of the law curse. And a lot of you guys are probably wondering what we're talking about, but it involves basically just the biblical concept of the curse versus the law, the difference between the prophetic interpretation and some of the biblical interpretations. So, anyways, Michael, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, to some people's disappointment, I was not actually raised in the synagogue. I was raised in the Christian Missionary Alliance. And so I was surrounded by missionaries my whole life. And the result was that I heard a lot from my missionary friends about the lengths they had to go to try to explain the gospel, not just in other languages, but in other cultures and other symbolic contexts. To use my favorite example, I had friends who were missionaries in Irian Jaya, and they were ministering to a tribe that had no concept of bread. They didn't grow any wheat or any rice or anything like that. They just had yams. So trying to explain, Jesus as the bread of life would have been like saying Jesus is the gerbil flax of life. It would have been nonsense. So they had explained, Jesus as the yam of life. And of course, now you've got to, okay, how do we explain an unleavened yam? Because you don't leaven yams. So they started talking about perfect yams. And so in having these conversations with the missionary friends I grew up with, I started realizing that the Bible itself had taken a very Middle Eastern religion and symbolism and culture, and the New Testament and Paul in particular translated it over into sort of Western terms. And that and a few other things led me into a quest to try to understand the Bible in its original Jewish context. And this eventually led me to a Messianic Jewish synagogue, where the rabbi took a shine to me, and over time I accidentally started a youth group, took over the prison ministry, fell in love, got married, went through 4 years of yeshiva, got ordained, went through 3 years of an internship. And so and then, I eventually left that organization just because they were going a different direction than I felt God calling me to. But God has sort of used the fact that I was raised in a church context, but have completely married into and returned to this Jewish context as giving me an ability to try to build some bridges. And if you go into the Messianic Jewish world, you find yourself questioning things that other people just sort of take for granted in terms of doctrine and so forth. And one of the things you run into is, of course, the standard Christian understanding of Paul is, oh, well, Paul says the old law is, not only not necessary, but it's somehow dangerous to your faith. And so you need to not do all those things of law, but, instead be under grace. And that becomes a problem if you actually read Paul's life in the book of Acts, because here Paul's running around doing things like, going to synagogue on the Sabbath, circumcising Timothy, going to taking a Nazirite vow, going to the temple, and not only making sacrifices for himself, but for 4 other guys. And he even says in his defense, look, I went to Jerusalem to go make sacrifices. And so that just doesn't jive with someone who's like, oh, no, you can't, if you keep the Sabbath or the feast days or kosher or anything like that, that's just wrong now. And so that realization has been led me to really digging into some of Paul's writings to really try to understand it. And I'm not the first, and I'm certainly in what I'm presenting, I'm building on the work of others. But I've come to a conclusion, which is sort of a modified new perspective on Paul. If you are familiar with the work of James Dunn, I thought about reaching over for his book there, but I don't want to disappear from the screen to do it. He wrote a book called The New Perspective on Paul, in which he argued that Paul, when he talks about the law in a negative sense, he's not talking about God's commandments generally. In other words, you're still not supposed to steal, you're still not supposed to commit adultery, you're still not supposed to murder, and everyone kind of acknowledges that. He narrowed it down to the Jewish particulars, primarily circumcision, the Sabbath, and the kosher laws. And so I'm just sort of building on that. I'm building on the work of D. Thomas Lancaster, who is one of the head researchers at First Fruits of Zion and very important in the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations, the UMJC. and sort of building on this. But ironically, it wasn't actually digging the Paul that really started and turned the light bulb on. So as I sort of go through this idea, I'm going to end up jumping all the way back to Isaiah. I'm going to be taking it and going to Deuteronomy. I'm going to try to avoid my usual predilection for rabbit trails, unless you really want me to go down one.
I like rabbit trails. Rabbit trails are all good, man. Yeah.
Well, we'll have a few rabbit trails, but let me sort of start with the passage that got me started on this whole thing, that really started me questioning in this direction. And it was not Paul, it was actually Isaiah. So you've got Isaiah chapter 11. Isaiah chapter 11 is, continuing on for chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10, all of which are about the Messiah, of course. 7 is the famous Emmanuel prophecy. 8 is one of the passages that's quoted in the New Testament talking about Yeshua, or Jesus, for those who aren't used to my Hebraisms, being the stone the builders rejected. Chapter 9 speaks about this light that would appear in Galilee and the coming king. And then chapter 11 starts off, there will come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit, and the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so that's obviously the Messiah, right? But then you get over to verse 10. In that day, the root of Jesse, okay, still the Messiah, right? In that day, the root of Jesse, the Messiah, shall stand as a signal or a banner for the peoples. Of him shall the nations inquire or seek, and his resting place will be glorious. Okay, so now you've got the nations coming to the Messiah. So far, so good. We're on pretty steady ground here. But then you get to verse 11. In that day, the Lord will extend his hand yet a second time to recover the remnant that remains of his people from Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Cush, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the coastlands of the sea. So basically the whole known world. He will raise a signal or a banner for the nations and assemble the banished of Israel and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. The jealousy of Ephraim will depart, and those who harass Judah shall be cut off. Ephraim shall not be jealous of Judah, and Judah shall not harass Ephraim. And it goes on from there. Okay, well, wait a minute. So here we've got a couple different groups here. We have the nations who are rallying to the Messiah as one rallies to a banner. I did some Society for Creative Anachronism type stuff back when I was younger. And so if you're out there in like a battle pre-radio and all that, and going sword to sword, it's very easy to get distracted by what's in front of you, and all of a sudden you look around, it's like, oh shoot, where's my side? You can get cut off and that kind of thing quickly. The thing you're looking for is the banner. The banner is where the king is at. The banner is your place of safety. So it's talking about the nations looking for that banner, looking for the root of Jesse, the Messiah, as their banner, as their king, as their place of safety. His resting place will be glorious. Okay, so that pretty much describes the church. But then you've got God reaching out his hand the second time to recover the remnant that remains of his people, which is defined as being the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Okay, the thing that got me wondering is, where did Isaiah get this idea that God would recover his people twice? Now, you and I, from the perspective of history, we know that happened. We know there was the Babylonian exile, and we know there, of course, was the diaspora of the last 2,000 years. But I'm looking at this going, okay, it's possible that God just sort of gave this to Isaiah, but my understanding of the prophets is that the prophets were being moved from the Spirit as they were drawing from the pre-existent scriptures. That's why Peter makes the point of saying, no prophecy of the scriptures is of any private interpretation, but men of God spoke as they were moved by the Spirit. In other words, he's saying that prophets are divinely inspired interpreters of the existing scriptures. So to me, that suggests that Isaiah had to have gotten this idea of two exiles from somewhere. And as a matter of fact, if you come from a Messianic Jewish perspective and you're sort of steeped in the rabbis and that kind of thing, you know that the rabbis consider the Torah to be the foundation and wellspring of all prophecy. So I was just testing a theory at the time. It's like, okay, if the rabbis are correct, I should be able to find this somewhere in the Torah, this idea of two exiles. And I found it in a couple of places. One was in the life of Jacob, but the other was a lot more explicit. And this took me to Deuteronomy chapter 28. Deuteronomy chapter 28 is the curse of the law. It is a set of punishments laid out for the nation if the nation broke the covenant. The whole book of Deuteronomy is written in the form of a Hittite suzerain vassal treaty. In other words, a treaty between an overking and a lesser king, or a king and his people. And the Hittites always wrote in certain elements, which are all here in Deuteronomy, including, here are the blessings if you keep the covenant, here are the curses if you break the covenant. Chapters 27 through 30 are the blessings and the curses, and then they're sort of reiterated with witnesses in chapters 31 through 33. So chapter 28, the thing is, no one likes to do any real study in chapter 28. It's depressing. It's grinding with just the bad things happening over and over. You can go and find commentaries that are like verse for verse everywhere else, and then they'll dedicate like 3 chapters to chapter 28 and move on. But if you go through and read it very carefully, a different picture emerges. So I'm going to skip around a little bit here. Verses 1 through 35 describe the people of Israel not prospering, describe their goods being taken, their children being taken, their land being taken, everything else. And then you get to verse 36. The Lord will bring you and your king, whom you set over you, to a nation that neither you nor your fathers have known. And there you will serve other gods of wood and stone. Okay. Now, after that, you go forward a few more verses, and it starts describing it describes the people being, and the Gentiles among them being prospered over them. And they get to verse 39 or verse 49. The Lord will bring a nation against you from far away, from the land of from the end of the earth, swooping down like the eagle, a nation whose language you do not understand. And the rabbis have always consistently understood that to be the Romans. Now you go through and it describes another siege. So there's an implied, the nation was in the land, taken out of the land, returns to the land, another siege, and then we get to verse 64. And the Lord will scatter you among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your fathers have known. And among these nations you will find no respite, and there will be no resting place for the sole of your foot, but the Lord will give you there a trembling heart and failing eyes and a languishing soul. Your life shall hang in doubt before you day and night. You shall be in dread and shall have no assurance of your life. Okay, and it goes on in that vein for a couple more verses. Now, those cannot be the same exile. And here's why. The first exile, when Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 29, verse 5, going forward, he's writing to those in exiles, and he says, look, you're going to be here for 70 years. So build houses, plant vineyards, get married, and pray for the peace of the city you're in, for in its peace you will have peace. And it's true, the Babylonian captivity was a period of peace. There was not massive persecution. You did not see the Jews scattered from land to land. They had the peace protection of Nebuchadnezzar, probably in part because Daniel was influencing him. And then when the Persians came in, they showed the Persians, hey, here are our prophecies. We've been expecting you. Cyrus, we've got a letter here from you by name from our God. And so the Persians protected them, minus an element with Haman, but the Babylonian exile was one that was the chains rested so lightly that very few went back with Ezra and Nehemiah when they went back to the land, right? That does not fit with this idea we see in the end here where it says, among those nations you shall find no respite, and there will be no resting place for the sole of your foot. That does fit perfectly the last 2,000 years where, Jews would be settled in one land, would end up loaning money to the king. The king would get in debt and say, I want to cancel my debt. Time to kick the Jews out, and they'd have to go somewhere else. On the other hand, you can't say that the first exile could be the last 2,000 years because it says the Lord will bring you and the king that you will set over you to a nation that neither you or your fathers have known. Israel didn't have a king at the time of the Roman diaspora. And certainly Yeshua wasn't being dragged anywhere, in chains, as it's implied here. So there are two exiles. Why is that important that Deuteronomy, the curse, specifies two exiles? A couple of reasons. Reason number one, if the curse went into effect before the Babylonian captivity, just destroyed one of the most persistent anti-Semitic falsehoods that has been passed down through Christianity through the centuries, and that is this idea that the Jews were cursed because they rejected Jesus. If the curse had been in effect for 700 years already, then the curse is not about the rejection of Jesus. I'm not saying there's no relation, but it's not why it happened. I'll come back to that. Reason number two, because we're going to see when we get to Deuteronomy chapter 30, that it specifies that the curse would come to an end before Israel returned to the land. And that the curse was a unified curse, that both exiles had to happen before Israel could come back into the land. Well, if that's the case, Israel's back in the land. And we're in a very interesting phase of history. It's not just that Israel's back in the land and, oh, that's a sign that something's about to happen. Israel being back in the land is the sign that something incredible has happened now. And it means that we have to look at Paul and Paul's writings a little bit differently than most people have read, because one of the main issues Paul is dealing with, the curse of the law, is no longer the way it was. And that was a huge info dump, I know. So stopping here for a second, let's parse that down a little bit before moving on.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of information to absorb. So in summary, let's see if we can get this down to like a short paragraph for the people viewing and maybe the people who joined us later here.
Okay. The curse there is a specific curse that the Sinaitic covenant, the law, set on the people if the people broke the covenant. That curse specifies there would be two distinct exiles. We can identify those exiles as the Babylonian exile and later the Roman diaspora. First, the curse did not come about because the Jews rejected Jesus. On the contrary, I'm going to show that the Jews rejected Yeshua because the curse was already in effect. Number two, and when we get to Deuteronomy chapter 30, I'm just going to hold off on that, other than just sort of set up here. We're going to see that it specifies that the whole curse must take place, and then Israel must repent before God returned Israel to the land. If Israel is now returning to the land, that implies that this curse that has been the dominating factor in Israel for 2,700 years is either over or it's like on its last legs and about to be over. Okay. Either way, we are in a whole new ball game. Not just that Israel's a sign that the end is about to happen. We are in a whole new ball game here and now, and there are some other prophecies I'll point to along the way to demonstrate that.
Okay, so my understanding of the curse and the law, my interpretation has always been that basically the sin nature in basically not having Christ, the fleshly realm, is being under the curse and under the law. I mean, wouldn't you agree that that's kind of a lot of the modern assumptions of it?
That is the modern assumption. Okay. But it doesn't really hold true. And here's why. Okay. In Paul's mindset, the Gentiles, the pagans, weren't under the law. How do I know? Well, because in chapter 4 of Galatians, starting at verse 21, he starts off by saying, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law," it's literally just under law. The word "the" is not there, but that's a minor equivalent point. "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law?" And there are Greek expositors that point out that Paul is very specific about when he says law versus the law, and that's why I bring that up. Now, so he's contrasting under the law with the law, the Torah. Okay, so when he says to the Gentiles, "You desire to be under the law," that implies that's not their natural state, right? If they're not under the law, how could they be under the punishment of the law? The law's punishments only apply to those who are under its covenant. A people who had not agreed to that covenant did not agree to be punished for violating it.
Interesting.
So Paul defines under the law for us. He goes on, he talks about Hagar and Sarah as being a picture of two covenants. Hagar being the covenant of Mount Sinai in Arabia, because her descendants ultimately settled Arabia, and Sarah being a picture of the new covenant. So Paul defines for us under the law means to be under this specific covenant. It's not talking about a particular set of commandments per se. It's talking about being under the covenant, the Sinaitic covenant. For someone who's born Jewish, Okay, you're born of Abraham's seed, so you're born into Abraham's promises. When you're circumcised on the 8th day, it is sealing you to Abraham's promises, but it is also a seal into the Sinaitic covenant. That's the way it's always been taken. That's the way the New Testament assumes it, is that a Jew who is circumcised on the 8th day becomes part of that covenant chain, part of the covenant of Sinai, because it's the Sinaitic covenant that made Israel a nation. That was the signing of the Constitution, if you will. So it's perfectly natural for someone who's born Jewish to be born to Abraham's promise, to be signed and to be sealed in on the 8th day as a member of that covenant. A Jew can then continue to move forward, and by faith in Yeshua the Messiah, faith in Jesus Christ, then go and become part of the new covenant. Paul's objection with the Gentiles, he's saying, no, you came in. Your first relationship with God was through the new covenant. The new covenant has been signed in the Messiah's blood. The new covenant is what gave you the Spirit. You received the Spirit by faith. So why are you now trying to go backwards? Go backwards to a covenant that was already broken. See, you can actually pinpoint when the covenant was broken.
When you say go back, you mean basically following the Torah, essentially?
Not following the Torah, going back to a different covenant. See, for Paul, there wasn't a problem with him following Torah. As a matter of fact, you see how often he instructs people out of the commands of the Torah, right?
Right.
So that's not the issue. Remember, to Paul's mind, and Paul quotes from Matthew's gospel several times, so he either had a really good oral tradition, or he actually had like a protocopy of Matthew's gospel, or Matthew's gospel account was written really early. So he was well aware of the fact that the Messiah himself, Yeshua, Jesus, said, I've not come to abolish the Torah and the prophets. Not to abolish, but to fulfill. Fulfill in that context means to demonstrate the full meaning of. And I can explain that and demonstrate that if you need to.
No, that's okay.
Heaven or earth will pass away before one jot or one tittle will pass away from the law. And therefore, if anyone loosens the least of these commandments and teaches others so, he will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But anyone who keeps them and does so will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Okay, contextually, which commandments he's talking about? Well, he's talking about the law. So Yeshua himself said, you can't even loosen the least commandments of the Torah. Now, you can certainly go after certain traditions that create conflicts with other commandments of God, but you can't loosen the commandments of the Torah. Now, let me clarify something here, because there are a lot of Hebrew roots people who come across that and therefore insist, well, that means that if you're eating pork and not being Passover and going to church on Sunday instead of resting on the Sabbath and so forth, then you're not in the kingdom. Well, first off, that's not true. Yeshua said loosening commandments could make you less in the kingdom. He didn't say anything about kicking you out, okay? But secondly, there are certain commandments that are only for certain people at certain times, okay? There are commandments that are only for the priests. There are commandments that are only for men. There are commandments only for women. Now, Jesus himself did not keep all 613 commandments. Why? Because some of them didn't apply to him. He wasn't a shepherd, and therefore the commandments for the shepherd, he was a good shepherd, but he wasn't a literal shepherd, and therefore the commandments for shepherds did not apply to him. He was not a farmer, and therefore the commandments of the first fruits that a farmer would bring, a landowner would bring, did not apply to him. He wasn't a woman. The commandments for menstruation didn't apply to him. And he wasn't
There was just something that I'd like to add to that.
Sure.
And I know people call it legalistic or whatever, but okay, so for the church on Sunday thing, my thing has always been okay, so when it's Saturday here, it's probably Sunday in China, right? So, I mean, you kind of get to the point to where it's you're getting so centered on this particular thing that it's how far do you have to go? This is kind of what the Pharisees did essentially to basically follow the Sabbath, if you helped a donkey out of a ditch. And I'm not saying that it's not legit to worship on Saturday. My thing is just you can get so technical with it that, really, let's face it, here, when it's Saturday, it's Sunday somewhere else, and vice versa. So it's I get it though. I mean, I understand the tradition behind that and everything, but yeah, when someone comes out and basically says, you've taken the mark of the beast because you're worshiping on Sunday, I just I'm holy cow. And I know that's enough. I'm not saying that's Hebrew roots. I realize it's not. I'm talking about the people that Seventh-day Adventists or whatever. I mean, I just hear a lot of theories out there. Most of the mainstream church celebrates on Sunday. I mean, I would say 90%. I don't know. I'd have to look at the statistics, but of the mainstream church celebrates on Sunday. So if that were the case, we're all doomed, basically.
No,
go ahead.
No, not at all. And that's sort of my point. I mean, within Messianic Judaism, the Sabbath is the fact that Jews rest from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday has been one of the distinct markers that has set Jews apart as a people. The fact that the church took Sunday as its holy day in honor of the resurrection, and therefore there was a separation there, has actually been a protective barrier for Jewish identity. Okay, so within Messianic Judaism, there's a big, there's sort of a general consensus of, you know what, it's not really desirable to have Christians come in and start, just willy-nilly grabbing onto these Jewish cultural distinctions. And so there's sort of an attitude that there are two laws, one for the world at large and one for Jews in particular. I break it down a little bit differently. My main thing is I'm not telling anyone that they're going to hell because they're worshiping on Sunday. Okay, we should worship every day. I get, the whole let's honor the resurrection with Sunday thing. That's fine. I wouldn't go and say, where I would object is where someone says, well, the Sabbath has been done away with, so you shouldn't do it. Well, I'm sorry, but for Jews, the Sabbath has never been done away with.
Right.
Neither has kosher. And I would argue from the Torah, not from the New Testament, from the Torah, that kosher is not required for Gentiles. And there are a whole host of land commandments that say, when you come into the land, the Lord your God will give you. Well, those aren't applicable outside the land.
Okay, so one more rabbit trail, Michael. I'm sorry, because you brought it up a couple times that I want to talk about to help maybe me understand better, maybe other people understand better. Is okay. So most of the mainstream will interpret that that eating of pork and all that is now acceptable because of Paul's vision, which to me it doesn't make a lot of sense, because when Paul is seeing this pig basically come down and the curtain from heaven, it's God's example of saying, I've made something unclean clean. Is that, in your interpretation, why it's okay for Gentiles to do that now, or break that down a little bit?
No, in Peter's vision Peter himself interprets it for us. He says, God has told me not to call any man profane or unclean. Okay, so in a vision, one thing symbolizes another. So the unclean animals coming down were symbolic of Peter towards at the time, Judaism basically regarded all Gentiles as being completely unclean, to the point where even the air around them was unclean. Even things that normally were not susceptible to be able to transmit uncleanness were considered unclean if they came from a Gentile. It wasn't universally adhered to, but that was like the attitude. It actually developed about 50 years before Yeshua's birth, and that's a whole different subject. So that has nothing to do with it. And when Yeshua spoke about the whole ritual washing of hands thing, that had nothing to do with whether to eat unclean meat. They were discussing eating bread. And what I would say is the Torah, forget the New Testament for a second, the Torah says that Gentiles don't have to keep kosher. How do I know? Two reasons. One, Noah, after he got off the ark, he was told, you may now eat anything that crawls on the face of the earth. It would have taken fewer words to record God saying, you may eat anything that's clean. The fact that God said you may eat anything on anything that crawls on the earth, and used a longer phrase to say that, tells us that he meant anything, clean or unclean. No one knew the difference between clean and unclean. To him, clean is tahor. A tahor animal is one that can be sacrificed. A tamei animal, an unclean animal, is one that cannot be sacrificed. He was not told he could eat only what could be sacrificed. He was told you can eat anything, but he knew the difference. Later in Deuteronomy, it makes the point that if something is torn, the technical term is trafe, but basically like an ox gets attacked by a wolf and you drive the wolf off, but the ox is still dead. It wasn't slaughtered specifically for food. An Israelite can't eat that, but he may give the meat to a ger, or he may sell it to a nakor. Now, what's a ger? A ger is a alien resident in the land, one who is coming specifically to worship the God of Israel. How do we know? Because the ger was forbidden from idolatry, and he was allowed to make sacrifice under the same rules as a native-born Israelite. If he wished, he could circumcise himself and his sons and start taking part in the Passover, and he would become basically the naturalization process. But he was not required to. A Nakor is basically pagan, like a merchant passing through, something like that. A Nakor did not receive the same permissions as the Ger, but here's the thing. If God's saying, look, the alien resident who is here to worship me, you may give him meat that is not clean for you, and you may sell it to Gentiles that are passing through, then doesn't that mean that God doesn't have a problem with Gentiles eating meat that is not suitable for Jews? Between that and Noah, the rabbis have always understood that kosher was specifically for the Jewish people. It was basically God saying, look, you are my nation of priests. Therefore, I want you to only put into the temple of your body that which you would bring to my temple in Jerusalem. It's a physical discipline for the purpose of setting Israel apart as a people, which it has succeeded in, and it's supposed to carry over into the spiritual discipline of not bringing anything into yourself that you wouldn't want to bring into God's physical temple. But it was never a universal.
And that being said, there is no commandment or law that we find anywhere that talks about the health benefits of eating bacon. So
no, there is not. You can get
so the other side of the coin is it may not be good for you, folks. There's a good chance eating copious amounts of bacon is bad for you.
I remember seeing online one time someone drew a chart of his general health, and then you see it going down, and then the line showing where it starts to go down is the day I realized I could cook bacon anytime I wanted to.
Yeah. Well, we had a guy come to our church one time that basically, he was talking about just that it's not good for you, and he talked about an experiment they did where they stacked a bunch of hog cages on top of each other, and they only fed the hog at the top. And he basically said the rest of the hogs ate just fine. And he was basically just saying that, you are what you eat, right? And some of the stuff that these animals eat. Ugh. Yeah. Anyways.
Yeah. And health reasons, there's something to be said for it. I will point out that deer is perfectly kosher, and yet you can get trichinosis from it just as fast as you can from undercooked pork. And a lot depends on what you choose to feed your animals. There are a lot. Goats will eat anything too, but they're perfectly kosher. I think there are some health benefits, but that's not the primary reason.
Right.
And so people who want to justify with health benefits, hey, once I started keeping kosher, I will be the first to admit that my blood pressure went down, but that had more to do with the fact that I was actually paying attention to what I eat and was eating a lot less salty junk. And there are ways to eat a lot less salty junk while enjoying the occasional pork roast for those, again, who are Gentile. My only thing is, God didn't tell the Jews not to keep these commandments anymore. That was imposed from the 2nd century on, and particularly after the 4th century, by the church after it became Gentile dominated. But if you look at the lives of the apostles, they're still keeping all the commandments. They're going to temple anytime they're in town. They're going. You remember how Peter and John healed the blind guy? If you pay attention to the time they did it, they were going up to take part in the sacrificial service. Well, if they're taking part in the sacrificial service, then they obviously still consider kosher to be important. Paul makes the point of saying, hey, I did not enter into the temple in a state of uncleanness. Well, that means he'd been keeping a kosher diet for at least a week, and that he took the time to ritually purify himself after he got back into Israel. So he still considered all those ritual purity things to be important for him as an Israelite.
Right.
So these commandments are still valid, but they have to be in their proper place and time. And for Christianity as a whole, generally speaking, and there are a few places where I would quibble on technical points, but generally speaking, Christians have been keeping the commandments they were supposed to over the centuries in terms of their personal lives. Where I would mostly find fault is the way Christians have treated Jews for centuries.
There was a few times that they were treated a little bit unfavorably, if I recall. The Crusades being one of them, Martin Luther and his anti-Semitism. That a lot of people see Martin Luther as like the best thing since sliced bread, but they don't realize his anti-Semite views. He was basically advocating the killing of Jews towards the end of his life.
I'll be fair to Martin Luther. At the beginning of his life, he was very philo-Semitic. He wrote what was a revolutionary document at the time, that Jesus Christ was born a Jew. And he actually castigated the church for its treatment of the Jews, said, look, if I were born a Jew, I wouldn't want to believe in this either. And he actually came out and advocated basically for what we'd call Messianic Judaism today, this idea that, hey, if we tell the Jews there's nothing good in their culture and everything's evil, of course they're not going to come in. There needs to be a place for Jews to be Jews in the church. That was revolutionary at the time. What happened later was he was getting, older, sicker, and a little bit more arrogant as time went on. And he was exposed to some passages from the Talmud and some of the other Jewish sources that, let's just say, are not very complimentary to Jesus. Yeah. And it set him off. And by the time he was used to just going off with the drop of a hat. And he was counseled by his best friends who were around him, who had known him for years. Please don't write this. The guy who translated his works into Swedish deliberately fudged the translation of the Jews and their lies because he realized that it was just off base. So it was it was tragic. I think the adversary used that, but that was towards the end of his life, and it's not the sum total of his life there, to be fair to my Lutheran friends here.
Okay. Well, and my goal there was not to just totally demonize him, because I know he did good work as well. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of this inside stuff sometimes that folks don't know. But anyways, back off the rabbit trail, because that's like the sixth one now. I promise I will finish my McRib sandwich later. This is all for my comfort. I'm over here. I've got 3 strips cooking on the stove right now. I'm getting all clear, basically. Is what I'm saying. So, no,
well, sorry, McRibs are not kosher even for Gentiles.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier. It's the most unclean form of pork there is, and I can agree with that as well, man. It is disgusting. I used to love it.
Are we even sure it's pork?
I don't think so.
I think sure it's identifiable.
I don't know what's in it, man. I doubt there's even pork in it. There's probably something grosser than pork in it, but. Anyways, okay, so go ahead.
And I'll clarify just one thing, because I do have a lot of Hebrews friends. I'm not telling you can't take part in this. I'm just saying lay off of your Sunday brethren, okay? It's not the hill to die on. It's certainly not where to divide the body of Messiah over.
Well, and I do have some friends in Hebrew roots, and I've had conversations with them before, and our discussion has always been like, what do you really want to divide over? If it comes down to salvation, yeah, that's a hill I'll stand on. But the rest of the stuff, you're not going to get to heaven and Jesus or the Lord be standing there and be like, hold on 1 second, before you come through the gate, do you have bacon on you? And did you just come from a Sunday service, So that's where I just, we all have, doctrine is important, but we all have flaws in our doctrine. I don't care who you are. Sure. How can I tell you that? Is because when Jesus came on the scene, there were over 200 sects of Judaism at the time. And so it's in our nature, it's in man's nature to divide. It's the carnal, if we were all perfectly in spirit and in unity, that wouldn't happen. But the flesh gets in the way, ego gets in the way, and our intellect gets in the way. And unfortunately, you have these splits, and these, people will fight on a hill that's just not worth fighting on, in my opinion, yeah, I'm the same way, man. I respect everybody and say, as long as you're not teaching something that's contrary to the salvation message, if you're going to start saying you can get to heaven anyway, now I am going to fight you on that. I'm going to argue with you on that. But everything else, you know what? Let's just be the body of Christ, because when it comes down to it, one day there's not going to be churches or denominations. We'll all be together. And you know what? If it's all Hebrew roots, that's fantastic, man. And I'll be like, oh, crud, I should have gotten on board, and if it's all something else, whatever. It won't be Hebrew roots. It'll just be the church,
Exactly.
Anyways, okay, so back to the topic then.
Okay.
We got off on a few there.
Where were we? So, yeah, that was all by way of saying that as I discuss this issue of the law and the commandments and so forth, I'm not trying to, tell everyone to do it my way or anything like that. And so I want to separate that idea there. But Paul's emphasis when he defines for us the key issue being under the law means to be under the Sinaitic covenant. He's telling the Gentiles coming in, the Gentile Christians, look, you were not under the law. We broke that covenant. It is bringing about a curse. So why are you trying? You're already in relationship with the Lord. Why are you trying to come back to this other covenant. Okay. And that's where he's using the language, going back to Galatians chapter 3, of the curse of the law. So Galatians chapter 3, verse 10 says, all who rely on, or all who are of, works of the law are under the curse. For it is written, cursed be anyone who does not abide by all the things written in the book of the law to do them. That's the last verse of Deuteronomy 27, right before chapter 28 that we talked about earlier. Now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law, or by law, for the righteous shall live by faith. But the law is not of faith, rather the one who does them shall live by them. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree, so in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so we might receive the promised Spirit through faith. Okay, so now this whole paragraph is one that people stumble over. You can go and read a dozen different commentaries on Galatians, and you will find that there are a dozen different subtle different takes on it, because it's just one of those things that's kind of difficult. So let's break it down a little bit. All who rely on works of the law. What are works of the law? Well, under law means under the covenant of Sinai. So works of law are the specific commandments that were considered to be part of entering into or maintaining fellowship in that covenant. Circumcision being the most important. You see that all throughout. Every time he talks about the works of the law, he's talking about circumcision. James Dunn and others would also include the Sabbath and the kosher laws on that. But circumcision is the entry point for being in the Sinaitic covenant, and so that's what he's referring to there.
And the most painful.
Yes, especially if you're an adult. My son was circumcised by an Orthodox rabbi on the 8th day. I'm happy he doesn't remember it. It was very traumatic for his mother.
Can you imagine Abraham? I mean,
yeah,
wow,
100 years old here.
Yeah, okay.
We can go into the symbolism of circumcision if we want to, but let's hang on here for a second. All right, so all who are of work or rely on works of law are under a curse. For it is written, cursed everyone who does not abide by all the things written in the book of law to do them. Now, Paul's point is not saying, see, if you don't keep everything perfectly, you're under God's curse, because the Torah itself anticipates people being less than perfect. It has second best solutions. Oh, you stole something, here's how you have to restore it. Oh, you decide to jump the gun with that maiden, now you get to marry her and you can't divorce her, you have to take care of her for the rest of your life. Oh, you accidentally, brought uncleanness in the temple, now you've got to make this sacrifice and replace whatever you might have touched and contaminated in there. It's got second best solutions. Even down to, oh, you completely screwed up your finances and there's no hope. Well, you can sell yourself into indentured servitude for 7 years. You will have someone who will take care of you. Your debts will be paid, and then you can you'll be able to start your life over. I mean, it anticipates less than perfection. That's not the point. The point is that Israel as a whole had not abided by all the things written in the Torah to do them. Now, Paul says, now it is evident that no one is justified before God by law, not the law, but by law, for the righteous shall live by faith. Now, there he is quoting from Habakkuk 2:4. Except that's not what Habakkuk 2:4 says in the original Hebrew. It's literally, the righteous one shall live by his faithfulness, by his loyalty, by his steadfastness. See, in Greek, the word for faith, pistis, has two meanings. It means to trust in, but to be faithful towards. Why? Because it's the attitude you take towards a benefactor. Someone's done something wonderful for you. Someone's given you this gift that you can't pay back. What are you going to do? You're going to trust his benevolence because he's already proven it. And you're going to be faithful to him. If he asks you to do something, you're going to be happy to do it. Not because you think that makes things even, but just because, yeah, sure, you helped me out. I want to help you out. That's the whole meaning of the word. You can go pick up a book by David De Silva, Honor, Patronage, Purity, and Kinship. I think is the name of the book, and it goes into the whole term here. So Paul is pointing out that it's not just trust or a professed belief, but faithfulness. Why is that a problem? He's quoting from Habakkuk, who's in a faithless time. Habakkuk's whole thing is like, look, the nation's been faithless, and now you're sending these Babylonians who are worse than we are to come punish us. And God's response is, look, the wicked one is unstable. You can't trust what he's saying, but the righteous shall live by faithfulness. Paul's quoting that. He's saying, look, the real solution here is not, okay, let's try to make the laws try to make it so nobody can break the laws or anything like that. The real thing is not to try to go back and fix the already broken covenant. It is to be righteous, you must be faithful to God, and God has given us the avenue of faithfulness in the Messiah Yeshua, in Christ Jesus. Okay? You can't have the faithfulness without that. But the law is not a faith. In other words, but law is not faith. The word "the" is not there in the Greek. He's talking about the covenant of law. Why? It's not a faithfulness, because Israel was not faithful to it. Nevertheless, the one who does them shall live by them. What that means is, look, if you're going to keep this, it has to be a lifelong proposition. It's not something you get into and just, I'll keep a few commands here and there and I'll feel happy about myself. It's that verse in the original Hebrew means that if you're going to do them, your whole life has to be wrapped around them. But then he goes on and says, but Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law. The curse the law pronounces on those who break it, by becoming a curse for us, so that in him the blessings of Abraham might come to the Gentiles as well, so we might receive the promised Spirit through faith. Okay. Paul's whole point is, you can't look, the covenant was broken. It was broken 700 years ago. It was broken in the days of King Manasseh. Jeremiah said it was broken. That's why we needed a new covenant. Jeremiah 31:31. We have to have a new covenant because the old one's broken. It'd be like, when Moses threw down the stone tablets with that, when he came off the mountain, I bring you these 15, these 10 commandments.
Yeah. Mel Brooks. Okay.
No, but in seriousness, when he threw them down, he wasn't just ticked off. He was showing, look, guys, commandment number 2, no idols. We're 40 days in. You're already breaking it. Great. You just broke the covenant. I just knocked my camera around.
Wow.
Trying to go back to the old covenant, trying to fix the Sinai covenant would be like going up and trying to piece together and glue together the pieces of the tablet Moses had broken. It took Moses going back up and bringing a new set of tablets down to restore the relationship.
Okay, so you're telling me that when Moses literally came down the mountain with the 10 commandments, that the covenant had already been broken at that point?
Yeah, because the people were worshiping an idol when he came down.
Holy cow.
And that Hebrew actually says they were having a whole orgy going on. That's why it wasn't just that they'd made a golden calf for a nice orderly worship. They made the golden calf and had a whole orgy. The word can actually be translated to suggest there was murder in the camp.
Like sexual orgy.
Yeah, because that's the way the pagans tend to worship.
Which is not kosher.
Nope. So God says, all right, if you do what I say, I will live among you. I, the eternal creator who created the other gods, and you've just seen me kick their tails in Egypt. I, the eternal creator, will be your God and dwell in your midst, and you will be my people. And the people said, everything you tell us to do, we'll do. 40 days later, what's with the calf? What's with the orgy? What's going on? And the people were still going on. That's why he sent the Levites out with swords, because when he did that, not everyone stopped. He had to use violence to put an end to it. It was get so out of control.
And so was there a prophecy anywhere that indicated how short the covenant would be kept? Anybody come along and say, by the way, that covenant will last 10 days, and then you got to wait 700 years.
Well, that one lasted 40 days, and then he broke the covenant, or he broke the tablets, showing the covenant was broken. He then sent the Levites through the camp, and they slaughtered those who kept on going after they saw God's displeasure, and there was also another plague of some sort that killed many people. Then he took his personal tent. He called it the tent of meeting, the same name that he would give the tabernacle when it was built later, moved it outside the camp. Who wanted to go seek the Lord had to leave the camp to go to Moses to seek the Lord's face. That is the sign that when God saw this, his first response is, all right, Moses, I'm going to destroy all of them and start over with you. Moses is like, no, if you're going to do that, destroy me too, because everyone will just say that I brought him out here to die because you couldn't keep your promises. God's like, fine, but I'm not going with them. I'm just going to put an angel over them like I do for all the other nations. I'll give them the land I promised Abraham, but I'm not going to go with them because they're stiff-necked people. I'll destroy them. So Moses moved the tent of meeting outside the camp. Anyone who went to seek the Lord had to go outside the camp to do it. That parallels exactly what happened with Yeshua. Okay, the sign of the covenant was broken. Okay. The tent of meeting, the temple was destroyed. And for the last 2,000 years, any Jew who wanted to seek the Lord, wanted to seek the prophet like Moses, has had to leave the camp of the Jewish people to go seek him.
I tell you what, Moses was one heck of a negotiator, though, man. I'm
Because
serious. Like today, he would be like the Donald Trump. Seriously.
I think he'd be a little bit better than Trump, but here's the thing. Moses
a Hebrew Donald Trump, yeah.
But here's the thing: Moses didn't stop there. He kept interceding, and it took a long period of time. We're not sure exactly how long, but then God says, "All right, Moses, cut me a new set of stone tablets. Bring them up here. I'll write on them again. We'll start over." Moses cut the tablets. He went up. By the way, you notice the first tablets God provided. The second one, Moses had to bring the tablets for God to write on, because the covenant was broken. To reinitiate the covenant, to restore the covenant, to renew the covenant, took a cooperation between God and man.
Yeah. Wow.
Now, here's the thing for my son. There are people out there who have this weird idea that somehow Israel lost the promises because of its disobedient, and then God shuffled aside and gave it to the
12 tribes. 12 tribes scenario.
If that is true, if Israel lost the covenant and it went to the church, then Yeshua is a worse intercessor than Moses. Because Moses kept going and kept interceding until Israel was restored. So you're going to tell me that Jesus Christ is worse at negotiating and interceding than Moses? I think there's something wrong with your theology there all of a sudden. So Moses went back up on the mountain with the new tablets. God wrote on them. And Moses came down. According to tradition, the day he came back with the new tablets showing that the covenant had been restored was on Yom Kippur. I happen to believe that's going to be the day that Yeshua is fully reconciled with Israel. So we have in the Torah a model for a covenant being broken, for a time when God would not be in the camp of Israel, but that he would still have one who is not guilty of the people's sin interceding for them, and then a new covenant being restored with them.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Is there something that happened in this story with the Israelites in the camp near Mount Sinai? Mount Sinai is the correct mountain, right?
It's not the Mount Sinai that people think it is.
Is there anything about this story that is symbolic of the future rejection of the Messiah? Because to me, the fact that they broke the covenant there, if that's the fact, there has to be something in that that's symbolic of future rejection of the Messiah that's missed, or I don't know. What's your take on that?
Not exactly in that particular scenario. Think of it in terms of Moses representing Yeshua spiritually. The people sort of rejected Moses because he didn't come back in time. You have to understand, the idol was not a replacement for God. The idol was a replacement for Moses.
They were still trying to worship the one true God. I realize that. But with an orgy, it just blows my mind.
Yeah, when they go to Aaron, they say, "Look, make us a god make us an idol so we can worship God, because we don't know what happened to Moses. He didn't come back on time. They waited 2 more hours; they would have been fine. But he didn't. Moses lingered on the 40th day that he said he was going to return on, and they're like, we don't know what happened to Moses. Give us an idol." Because they had spent all this time in Egypt watching the Egyptians worship idols, and there's a whole thing there of how the ancients believed you could do a ceremony to open the mouth of the idol and draw the god down into it, basically bringing a god down to a physical human level where you could interact with them. They were still worshiping the God of Israel. They, however, were asking for an idol that they could draw him down to them, because they had lost their intercessor. So in a sense, it's as if they rejected Moses for an idol.
Right, they went to an Egyptian kind of ritual, which is where they came out of. They went back to what they saw the Egyptians doing, essentially.
Yep, basically. I mean, it makes perfect sense just from a psychological, sociological standpoint.
Interesting.
Despite the hey, no idols. Okay, well, that is like one brief commandment against hundreds of years in pagan territory. We actually find out that many of them were still carrying the idols that they'd had in Egypt, and probably all the way from Canaan, because we know that Rachel smuggled idols from Laban's house with them when they went. And so they in the book of Joshua, as Joshua's making his farewell address, he's like, "Can you please finally get rid of the idols you brought from Egypt? Did we convince you yet? You don't need them."
Right.
So yeah, there was absolutely hidden idolatry all through the camp.
So this is fascinating. So, and I know we're running out of time here. So the statement that basically not under the law but grace. Okay, so we understand now that the law that they're talking about, based on what you're telling us, the law that they're talking about is actually what was broken basically at the time when Moses came down from the mountain, correct?
Yes, it's
Okay.
the law in its covenant aspect, not
Right.
talking about a particular set of commandments. It's talking about the law in its covenant aspect. And this is important if you're relying on Torah, if you're relying on keeping the Torah a particular way to be what defines you as God's people, well, then you are pretty much still committing that particular sin. But there's the other point I want to get to before we close out here tonight. And so let me read from Deuteronomy chapter 30. Starting at verse 1, when all these things have come upon you, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and return to the Lord your God, you and your children, and obey his voice and all that I command you this day with all your heart and with all your soul. Now, by the way, the Deuteronomy chapter 27 lists the things that would bring about the curse. Rejecting the Messiah is not on there. It's idolatry, sexual immorality, rejection of elders, robbery, social injustice, and rejecting the Torah. As a whole, have rejected all of those sins. So Jewish culture, even for Jews who don't believe, is built around keeping the Torah, believe it or not. Then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have mercy on you, and he will gather again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. That's what Isaiah was quoting from. Well, Israel's being restored and the Jews are being drawn back. That implies that the curse has run its course. If your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will take you. And the Lord your God will bring you into the land that your fathers possessed, that you may possess it, and he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. Israel, despite all the odds, continues to remain prosperous, interestingly enough. And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. If you just read that all in one thing, you might think that that all has to happen in one day. However, the later prophets didn't take that way. They all anticipated there'd be a period of time from the point where Israel was back in the land to the point where this circumcision of the heart takes place. That's Zechariah chapter 12. Jerusalem becomes a stone of trembling for all the people, and only after that does God open up this fount for forgiveness, right? Only after the attack. Verse 7, and the Lord your God will put all these curses on your foes and enemies who persecuted you. And that is the key to all prophecy and the reason why it's just incomplete. A preterist will argue that Revelation, the Olivet Discourse, this is all about Israel's punishment. I'm like, okay, sure, you want to say that? But Deuteronomy 37, if that's about Israel's punishment, it says, and the Lord your God will put all these curses on your foes and enemies who persecuted you. We are in the time where God is reaching out and cursing those who curse Israel.
Wow, that is scary considering what we're doing right now.
And that's why the adversary is working so darn hard to get Christians in America to turn against Israel.
Because it will curse us, essentially.
Exactly. Christians in the Middle East, and understand, I'm not trying to say they're getting what they deserve or that we should ignore it, but the persecution in the Middle East, you have to understand, Christians in the Middle East are some of the most anti-Semitic Christians on the planet. I think that part of the reason.
I mean, a common misconception, honestly, for a lot of people, even going back years, is that, in some of the church communities has been, well, Jews killed Christ. Well, if Jesus had been like Greek, it would have been Greeks killing Christ. It has nothing to do with the nationality. It just happens to be that he was rejected by his people. So
there was actually a paper put out some years ago by someone in the Messianic community called "The Right to Kill the Lamb." The basic essence of it was, okay, let's say the Jews did kill Jesus. Aren't you glad?
Exactly.
Shouldn't you be thanking them? It's like, come on. basically Israel in that respect acted almost as a priest offering up a sacrifice, not knowingly or intentionally, but nevertheless fulfilled that role.
Well, this has been fascinating, Michael, and honestly, it's so deep. I'm going to have to watch it again just to comprehend it all. But I'd like to have you back again, man. Let's talk again, and we'll figure out a time to discuss some other stuff. I would like to discuss, I think it would be a fascinating topic to discuss modern our modern relationship with Israel and what's going on right now, man, because right now we're trying to divide Israel into a two-state solution. If that happens, guess what happens to America, folks? I've been telling people this. I wrote an article about this in 2015 called The Coming American Civil War that basically talks about, look, we're getting ready to divide Israel. What do you think is going to happen to this nation? And
I've read your article, and I agree with you 100%.
Yeah.
I think it's coming. And I don't think it's
a matter of waiting for 60.
Yep. Okay, I came across it as I was doing research because I had a similar thought, and was seeing, if anyone out there had been thinking along the same lines, and it's like, yep, Jake gets it. It's
wow. Okay.
And I don't think God's going to wait for us to divide Israel, because I don't think God's going to let Israel be divided.
Awesome. So, Michael, why don't you give us your stats, your blog, webpage? Give us all your information real quick.
Sure. My main blog is called returnofbenjamin.com. You can go on WordPress to find it, but I've got the domain name, so it's just returnofbenjamin.com. We could do a whole session on why I named it that sometime. And pretty much everything I do is there. I've got a YouTube channel that I've just started up, but I post everything on that as well. And of course, I'm on Facebook. It's just Michael Bugg. And if you want to reach me, it's just Michael, Michael .bugg, Bugg, just like the insect with an extra G, at gmail.com. And if I'm a little bit slow in responding, it just means that my kids had a bad day, but I will get back to you.
Well, Michael, it's been a pleasure. And honestly, I've headed off with you. It's been entertaining. It's been fun. So I look forward to doing this again, man. I think you're a great fit for Seek for Truth audience, man. And guys, until next time, this has been Seek for Truth with Jake Rahutsky and Michael Bugg. God bless you guys.